Good morning, class. This is ECON 353 Macroeconomics class. Today is April 14th, Thursday.
We'll move on to chapter 13 of the textbook, which is the equilibrium in the long run of the economy. So here is the order of a video clip we are going to consider today. 1. The difference between short run and long run from the classical view. 2. Equilibrium in the long run and the short run. 3. Expectations in the long run and short run. 4. Long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. 5. Case study of U.S. national debt. 6. Phillips Curve. The definitions and historical record. Here is the first video clip.
From time to time, you'll hear a macroeconomist refer to the classical perspective on some problem, or a classical model. What does an economist mean by the term classical? It means simply this, that wages and prices adjust instantly to clear markets. The classical perspective in macroeconomics is to be contrasted with the Keynesian perspective. The Keynesian perspective is a view of the world as if wages and prices are sticky. But the classical perspective imagines that wages and prices adjust instantly to clear markets and asks, what is the outcome of fiscal and monetary policy going to be in a world where prices and wages adjust instantly? Let's look first at the classical view of the labor market. And it's very simple. The wage, or the price of labor, adjusts immediately to give us equilibrium. Here's the wage, or the price of labor, and here's the quantity of labor supplied and demanded in the labor market. The demand curve for labor represents the behavior of firms that hire labor in order to produce goods and services. The demand curve for labor is downward sloping because at higher wages, firms will use less labor and substitute to capital and other inputs instead. Also at higher wages, firms use less labor because they're producing less output. The demand curve for labor will shift when labor productivity changes, or whenever capital or the endowment of other resources changes, which makes firms willing to hire more labor at any given wage rate. So we've got this downward sloping demand curve for labor. The supply curve for labor, for the sake of simplicity, is going to be drawn vertically. Now, it isn't always going to be the case that the supply curve for labor is vertical, but in a classical view of the world, there are a certain number of people who want to work, and full employment means giving them all a job. So whatever the wage rate is in this simple classical view of the world, we've got a certain number of people, we can call this L sub F, full employment, that are ready and able to work. So what happens in the classical view of the world is this. The intersection of demand and supply points us towards an equilibrium wage rate, say $5 an hour. And this is the wage rate at which the quantity of labor demanded and the quantity of labor supplied are equal. If the wage were above this equilibrium, we would have fewer workers demanded than are wanting to show up for a job at that wage rate, and there would be excess supply of labor. In that case, the bidding mechanism would immediately correct this situation by pushing the wages downward. The same number of people, of course, would show up for work under the assumption of this inelastic supply. However, with lower wages now, firms find it profitable to hire more workers and use less capital, or simply to hire more workers to produce more output than before. On the other hand, suppose we have a wage rate that is below equilibrium. In this case, we have an excess demand for labor. There are more jobs that are looking for people to fill them than there are people who want to work. In this case, firms will bid up the wage rate in order to try to take workers away from each other. Competition for labor bids up the wage rate so that firms then choose to move along their demand curve, economizing on labor and using more capital instead, or simply producing less output. In the end, we have an equilibrium wage rate. The classical view of the economy is this: we are always at this point. We are always at the price and quantity at which the labor market clears. Any change in the demand for labor is going to immediately move us to a new wage rate. There's not going to be any period of unemployment or any period of excess employment. A shift in the demand curve for labor brings about an immediate adjustment in the wage rate to clear the labor market. And that's the way things work in the classical view of the economy. Now, if this is the case, then the economy is always at full employment. The given number of workers are always going to be working at whatever the going wage rate is, and we're going to be producing an amount of output that depends on only two things: the technology that is available to us and the number of workers that are available to work. We've got a given workforce, we've got a given technology, put those two things together, and we've got a set amount of output that can be produced in our economy, and that's called the full employment output level. So the resource endowment of your economy and the technology that these workers can use, which is going to also depend on capital stocks and the endowments of other natural resources, determines full employment output level. And full employment output level then determines the amount of output that will be produced in the classical macroeconomy. Let me go ahead and put on the vertical axis here now the overall price level in the macroeconomy, and on the horizontal axis output in our macroeconomy. And let me also go ahead and put in the classical supply curve. The classical aggregate supply curve is the total amount of output that is going to be produced in our economy at full employment. Well, the view of the classical economists is we are always at full employment, that the price level will change so as to bring us to the point where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal, and that will be the equilibrium price level in our economy. So suppose we were at some price level that were too low. If prices were too low, then the aggregate demand in our economy would be large. That is, prices are low, the given money supply is plentiful relative to the amount of shopping that people are doing, interest rates are low, people are buying stuff, businesses are buying capital goods, and there's a lot more demand than is being met by the output of our factories when workers are fully employed. Well, in this case, the bidding mechanism will kick in, push up the aggregate price level, and as the aggregate price level rises, the real money supply shrinks, or people demand more money to do their shopping, interest rates go up, and consumer spending and business spending is curtailed until we get to our equilibrium point, P star. If we have a price level that's above equilibrium, then in this case people are trying to demand a whole lot of money to do their shopping. Interest rates have been pushed way, way up as people scramble to get the cash to make their purchases. And in this case, we wind up with consumers and businesses doing very, very little purchasing because interest rates are so high. And in this case, we have a situation where aggregate supply exceeds aggregate demand. In that case, the prices will begin to fall because stuff is piling up on businesses' shelves. Excess inventories lead businesses to cut prices. And as they do, then the demand for money falls because people don't need as much money to do their shopping. Interest rates fall, and consumers and businesses increase their spending until we get back to our equilibrium price level, P star. This is the way the classical economy works. We are always at P star, and we are always at the full employment level of output. Wages and prices adjust continually, instantly, so as to keep us at full employment. When you hear the term classical, you know we're talking about a world where wages and prices adjust, and we are always at full employment. That's what it means. So if something happens to shift out the aggregate demand curve, say an increase in the money supply, which lowers interest rates and leads people to do more shopping at every price level, then what will happen is at the original price level, we have excess demand for goods. This excess demand pushes up prices, increases the demand for money, raises interest rates, and eventually brings us back to full employment at a new, higher price level. The interesting thing to notice about this classical adjustment is that prices do all the work. There's no increase in output because you can't ever have an output level that differs from full employment. Prices and wages adjusting constantly, instantly, frictionlessly, so as to keep us at the point where supply equals demand. The labor market clears, full employment output is the only option in this model, and if you're not there, prices are going to adjust instantly to take you there. It's an extreme view of the world, but it's one that's quite simple to analyze because you always have to be on the vertical blue line. And if you're not there, some wage or some price is going to adjust pretty fast to take you back there. We've developed the supply side of the economy, we've developed the demand side of the economy, and now we're ready to put the two sides together to find out what equilibrium looks like in the macroeconomy. Our study of equilibrium is going to proceed in three parts. In this part, we're going to look at the short run. What determines the aggregate price level and the output of the economy in the short run, when there's confusion about prices, when wages are fixed, and when prices are sticky. Next, we're going to talk about the adjustment process. What happens when the economy tries to produce more than the full employment level of output? What does that do to prices, and how do we show that in our model? That's the adjustment process. And finally, we're going to look at long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. What does the economy look like when all the adjustment is finished, all the dust has settled, and we wind up with a new price level and output? So let's begin with the short run. To examine short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, we'll need our aggregate demand curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve. So let's draw those. First, the downward sloping aggregate demand curve represents the inverse relationship between the aggregate price level and real gross domestic product. When the price level rises because of the wealth effect, because of the effect on foreigners, and because of the effect on the money supply through interest rates on investment spending, we get a lower level of real gross domestic product whenever the price level rises. So we've talked other places about why the aggregate demand curve slopes downwards. The short-run aggregate supply curve we've been drawing as an upward sloping line, representing the fact that when the price level rises in the economy, in the short run, we get an increase in real gross domestic product because firms respond to a higher aggregate price level by increasing their output. They perceive profit opportunities and therefore they produce more. They perceive profit opportunities because, first of all, wages are sticky in the short run. So when the price level rises, firms find that they're able to sell their products for more revenue, and yet the fixed wages keep their costs controlled. The profit opportunity leads them to produce more. Next, we have sticky prices. That is, some firms find it costly to change their prices in the short run, so they lag behind. And as the general price level rises, their products become a bargain. Customers run in to buy them while the prices are still low, and those firms then find it profitable to produce more. And finally, there's confusion in the short run. When the general price level rises and prices are going up and you're able to charge more for your product, as a business, you're not sure in the short run whether that's just an increase in demand for your product or whether it's general economy-wide inflation. And you respond to a perceived profit opportunity by producing more output in the short run. So let's look then, when we put these two curves together, at the point where they cross, because this is short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. The point where they cross is a price level, and let's call this P sub 0, and a level of real gross domestic product, let's call this Y sub 0, where the economy is in equilibrium. If the price level were below P sub 0, then look what would happen. If we were at a lower price level, then there would be a large aggregate demand. The lower prices would lead to a decreased demand for money, which would lead to lower interest rates, which would cause businesses to want to spend more. Also, with lower price levels, the real value or the purchasing power of wealth is higher, so consumers would spend more. Also, if our price level is lower, foreigners are going to buy our goods instead of goods from other countries. Also, with a lower price level, businesses are going to cut back their production because they perceive that they are losing profit opportunity. With the price level lower, when wages are fixed in the short run, businesses want to cut back because it's not profitable to produce. Also, with prices being sticky, some companies aren't going to be able to lower their prices fast enough, and they're going to lose customers, so they cut back their output. And finally, the third thing is expectations. The price level is falling, but you're not sure in the short run whether this is all over the economy or whether it's just you. People may not want your products, so you hedge your bets by cutting back your output. Well, look what happens. The lower price level in the short run gives us a small supply and a large demand. We have excess aggregate demand in the short run, and that would then tend to bid prices back up. We get exactly the opposite problem if the price level is above this equilibrium. If it is, then businesses are really gung-ho to produce because they've got lots of profit opportunity, they think, and therefore they increase production. Wages are set, prices are higher, and so on. Also, with a higher price level, demand is shrinking because the demand for money is going up, and with it interest rates, so business spending is falling, consumers aren't buying as much because their real wealth is shrinking, and foreigners are looking for bargains in other countries. That then creates a situation in which we have excess aggregate supply, and that will, with goods piling up on the shelves, lead businesses to lower their prices until we return to equilibrium. So this is what equilibrium looks like in the short run. It's a price level and a gross domestic product at which the quantity that people are willing and able to buy in the economy is equal to what businesses are producing. Now, let's do a few comparative statics exercises, shifting the curves to see how equilibrium changes. Let's begin with an increase in government spending. An increase in government spending is shown by an outward shift in the aggregate demand curve. If the aggregate demand curve shifts outwards, because the government now is spending more at any given price level, this means that the economy has to produce more at any given price level to give us an equilibrium. If this is the case, then at the original price level, we're going to have excess aggregate demand. So if I follow this dotted line over, this is the new aggregate demand with the government spending more, and it's way more than what businesses are producing, which we find by following the price level to where it touches the blue line. With the government and everybody else wanting to buy a lot, and businesses producing not enough, we have excess aggregate demand, and the price level begins to rise. As the price level rises, consumers, businesses, and foreigners buy less. And as the price level rises, with sticky wages, sticky prices, and confusion, businesses produce more until we reach our new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. That's going to be shown in our graph as an output level of Y1 and a price level of P1. So, the excess aggregate demand is resolved by rising prices, which reduce planned spending and increase planned production until we get to the new short-run macroeconomic equilibrium point. Let's consider another alternative. Suppose now we start with a situation in which aggregate demand and aggregate supply are crossing, and we've got macroeconomic equilibrium in the short run. And now let's consider a case where taxes are increased. If taxes are increased relative to this original macroeconomic equilibrium with a price level of P0 and an output level of Y0, we're going to have an aggregate demand curve shifting inward. Higher taxes reduce consumers' disposable income and cause consumers to spend less at every price level. This means that at the original price level, total planned spending is less than it was before. And since this price level gives us on the blue curve, this quantity of planned output, we now have excess aggregate supply. People are buying less than factories are making. That puts downward pressure on prices. And as the price level falls, consumers' real wealth increases, the demand for money decreases, and with it the interest rate, so that business spending increases, and foreigners buy more as well. However, as the price level falls, businesses sense that they don't have such good profit opportunities. Remember, wages are sticky. some prices are sticky, and there's confusion. So the falling prices lead businesses to produce less output than before. The new equilibrium then occurs at a lower level of real gross domestic product and a lower price level. So what happens when the aggregate demand curve shifts inward is the price level falls and output falls in the short run. This is the new point of short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Well, I've shifted the aggregate demand curve twice. I should shift the aggregate supply curve at least once for good measure. Remember, what shifts the aggregate supply curve is a change in expectations about prices. Once people believe that inflation is occurring in the economy, everyone wants to raise their prices so that they don't get left behind. Well, here's how this is going to look. We start with a situation where we've got aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, and we have macroeconomic equilibrium in the short run occurring where the two curves cross. So here's P0, the original price level, and our original gross domestic product, Y0. Let's suppose now that a war occurs in the Middle East and that oil prices are pushed up very quickly. Well, all the firms in our economy are now facing higher input prices, increasing their costs. So they're going to immediately pass those on to their customers in the form of higher prices. Otherwise, they'd have to drop out of business. So with a supply shock and higher oil prices, or higher input prices of any kind, what we have then is an upward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve from SRAS 0 to SRAS 1. Now, to produce any given level of output, businesses are going to charge a higher price. Well, look what this does. At the original price level P0, we still have the same aggregate demand, but now aggregate supply is less because of the increase in the cost of doing business. We now have excess aggregate demand for goods and services, and that then is going to cause price levels to rise. As price levels rise, we have the usual effects. Real wealth shrinks, the demand for money increases, and with it, higher prices lead to reduced demand for spending on the part of consumers, businesses, and foreigners. By the same token, whenever prices rise, businesses find that their profit opportunities are improving because wages are sticky, some prices are sticky, and there's confusion. Therefore, the rising prices lead businesses to produce more goods and services. Now, the net result is going to be that the supply shock winds up reducing real gross domestic product. Prices go up. However, with the rising prices, we get a reduction in real gross domestic product through the usual channels. This is short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. The aggregate demand curve intersecting the blue curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve. This, however, leaves us with a question. What if our output level is not at full employment? We've talked before about full employment output, the level of output that the economy can produce without causing inflation or deflation. We're now going to consider the relationship between the short-run equilibrium output level and full employment, and that's going to set up an adjustment dynamic. What happens to prices as they begin to move towards a long-run equilibrium level? We've talked about macroeconomic equilibrium in the short run, but you can't stay at the short run because the short run has no respect for the constraints of the economy. The economy has a speed limit called full employment output, and if the economy tries to produce more than full employment output, it's going to put upward pressure on prices. Now, this may sound abstract, the idea of being past some curve, creating some change in some variable, but this is a very human thing. If the economy is booming and everybody's trying to take advantage of a perceived profit opportunity by hiring more workers and getting more raw materials, what they're going to do is create a shortage. And when the shortage is created, workers and people who own raw materials are going to be able to charge higher prices for their goods and services. Prices begin to rise, you don't get any further increases in output, and the economy, being past its speed limit, moves into a zone of inflation. This is the adjustment process of the economy as we move from a short-run equilibrium in which we can violate the speed limit temporarily to a long-run equilibrium in which the speed limit must be respected. How do we get there? Well, we get there through a process of people figuring out what's going on in the economy. If the economy is running faster than its speed limit, prices are going to start rising. And at first, there's going to be confusion about that. At first, some prices are going to be sticky because of the cost of adjusting prices. At first, some wages and other input prices are going to be set by contracts, and the economy is not going to move immediately to its new long-run equilibrium point. But in time, people are going to figure out that this economy is running too fast. And in time, wages will rise as contracts are renegotiated. In time, input prices are going to go up. And in time, the confusion is going to lift, and people are going to realize that it's inflation, not profit opportunity. And when that happens, people will revise their estimates of inflation and build those into the prices they charge for their products. That's how we move from the short run to the long run. A process of people figuring out what's going on, changing their expectations. Let's look now at how the short run gives way to the long run through an adjustment process. We'll look first at how the adjustment process works, and next we'll consider how the way in which people form expectations influences the speed of the adjustment process. So, here's the long-run aggregate supply curve. That is the speed limit of the economy. It tells us how much output we can produce. We'll call this full employment output without creating inflation. If all of the resources in the economy are fully employed, this is the amount of stuff that we can produce. Now, we've got to consider then what happens when we're away from that green curve. When we're away from the green curve, we're either to its left or to its right. If we are to the left of the green curve, we're in a region of unemployment. That is, resources are not fully employed, there's slack in the economy. And in that case, there's going to tend to be downward pressure on prices. Prices are going to tend to fall because wages are going to tend to, over time, fall because workers are in surplus supply, and therefore companies can get their workers for lower wages. That may take time, however, because wages don't fall easily. Unions see to it that wages are kept as high as their bargaining power will allow. Also in time, over here, what happens is companies are able to adjust their prices downward when demand is slack, and over here in time also, all inputs being in more plentiful supply relative to demand is going to create a general downward pressure on prices. So the rule is, if the economy is running a lot slower than the speed limit, prices will adjust downward. So this is our adjustment dynamic for a period of unemployment. We get just the opposite on the other side of the economy. That is, if the economy is trying to run faster than full employment, there's going to tend to be upward pressure on prices. That is because labor and other raw materials are going to be in short supply. Companies want to produce more than the economy can produce with fully employed resources, and therefore companies go and try to bid workers away from each other. They go and try to bid raw materials like lumber and aluminum away from each other, and when that happens, the price of everything goes up. In the long run, you can't get more than the full employment level of output. In the short run, however, you can violate the speed limit. You can bring people into the market who don't really want to work at lower wages. You can entice companies to go further up the hill to cut down expensive timber. But in the long run, you can't do that. You can't go faster than the speed limit. And in the short run, what happens is prices begin to rise. So the green curve, besides showing us the point of full employment, divides the economy into two zones. A zone where prices are falling because of unemployment, and a zone where prices are rising because of the economy violating its speed limit, trying to overemploy or create fierce competition for inputs. Now that you know that, you can see how the short-run equilibrium is not a sustainable point. Let's take an example. Suppose we have aggregate demand right here. So the combined spending plans of businesses, the government, foreigners, and consumers gives us this curve. Here's the short-run aggregate supply curve. And where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect in the short run is always where the economy is. So the economy is right here, right now. So we're going to start with Y sub 0 for our gross domestic product and P sub 0 for our aggregate price level. Now, that's short-run equilibrium. Firms are producing what people want to buy. However, it is not a stable point. Why? Because the economy is running faster than its speed limit. We're producing more output than full employment. Because we're producing more output than full employment, the price level is going to tend to rise. Now, we already got an increase in prices to coax firms to produce that extra output in the short run. However, because of the intense competition for labor, raw materials, and other productive resources, prices are going to start to rise in the economy. And firms are going to begin, three things are going to happen that's going to cause the blue curve to shift up. And those three things are, first, the competition for labor is going to cause wages to rise, and firms pass the higher wage costs along in the form of higher prices for any given level of output. Number two, what's going to happen is firms are going to form expectations that in fact it's not increased demand for their product, but rather it is general inflation. Once they've figured out that it's general inflation, they raise their prices so that they're not caught behind. And third, what firms are going to do is they're going to be able to raise their prices because that sticky price problem, the problem of small menu costs, goes away in the long run. In time, you find that you have to reprint your menus anyway, or you have your usual inventory where you stamp the price on products. In time, it's not costly to change the prices because you change prices regularly as a matter of restocking your shelves and other business activities. So, in the long run, or in the adjustment process, three things happen. Wages are renegotiated upward, prices are marked higher, and firms figure out that it's inflation, not a business opportunity, and therefore they raise their prices to keep up. We would show that in this picture by an upward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. We move from SRAS 0 to SRAS1, a new short-run aggregate supply curve that factors in higher wages, the expectation of higher prices, and firms going ahead and changing their menus. So the prices rise. What happens in that case is aggregate demand. We're going to move along the aggregate demand curve to a smaller quantity of aggregate demand. The rising prices shrinks real wealth and causes consumers to purchase less. It increases the demand for money, increasing interest rates and shrinking business spending, all the usual story. We move along the aggregate demand curve to a new lower level of real gross domestic product, call that Y1. So what's happening then in the adjustment process is that as firms discover that we're in an inflationary economy, prices begin to rise and aggregate demand shrinks. Now, when is this process going to end? Well, as long as our output is above full employment, the general price level keeps rising. That means the aggregate demand curve keeps shifting upward until finally we reach a point to where we have returned to full employment. That is, things are going to end when the short-run aggregate supply curve has adjusted far enough to bring the economy back to full employment. That's when this price pressure ends. We're going to call this short-run aggregate supply curve infinity, because this is where we finally get when all the adjustment is done. That is, after all the adjustment is done, we wind up at this point with the new aggregate price level being higher than the old one, but output having returned to its stable level of full employment. That's when the adjustment process is over. In the meantime, the economy is going through a learning process. Wages are rising, prices are being adjusted upwards, and people are discovering that we're in an inflationary period, not improved business opportunities. Well, this raises a question. How long does it take to get from this original situation of output above full employment to the new long-run equilibrium? How long does it take? And the answer is it depends on how quickly people discover what's going on. How do people form their expectations about where prices are going? If people are forming their expectations in a form that we call adaptive, then they are backward looking. They're looking at what's happening in the recent past to form their ideas about the future. In that case, people say, prices went up a little bit last year. I bet they're going to go up a little bit this year. This year's inflation rate is probably going to be a lot like last year's. So if people are backward looking, forming their expectations adaptively, basing their decisions of the future based on what's happened in the past, then the economy may adjust very slowly to get from this point to this new long-run equilibrium. On the other hand, if people form their expectations by looking ahead, they have so-called rational expectations. People are carrying around in their head a picture of this model. They're carrying around this story about the economy, and they say to themselves, given that aggregate demand is all the way out here, prices have to keep rising until we get to this point of full employment. If that's the case, if people are rational and forward-looking, if they form their opinions about the future based on the model, then what happens is we may jump immediately to the long-run equilibrium. If expectations are rational, the long run may turn into the short run. That is, people may say, the economy is going to keep adjusting till we get to this point, so I'm going to go ahead and raise my prices anyway so I don't get caught behind. Workers see that we are out of equilibrium, and therefore they want their increase in wages now so that they don't suffer through inflation. If everybody understands that this is where the economy is going, they may take action now that results in shifting the short-run supply curve up through their choices, asking for higher wages, marking their goods at higher prices now, and in so doing, take us immediately to the long run. So, if expectations are backward-looking or adaptive, the economy ratchets up slowly. If, however, they are forward-looking and rational, then the economy may move very quickly or immediately to the new long run. In this era of better and better information technology, we have reason to expect that expectations are becoming increasingly rational. We have better models to predict where the economy is going, instant access to all the data we need to run those models. I mean, it's probably not very long before a freeze in a farm in Florida immediately shows up in a computer ticker at your grocery store as higher orange juice prices, that all goods are priced the way stocks and bonds are priced electronically, changing throughout the day in response to news on the markets. Well, let me say one more thing about the aggregate supply curve. Here is the long-run aggregate supply curve. This is the point of full employment. The adjustment process is asymmetric. That is, prices tend to rise more easily than they fall, probably because, due to the power of labor unions and the attitudes of workers, wages don't fall very easily. If this is true, then the short-run aggregate supply curve may actually look less like the smooth line we've been drawing and more like a kind of kink. That is, in the short run, what we get is a kind of asymmetry between prices rising and prices falling. That is, if the economy tries to go over the speed limit, it may be that prices rise very rapidly and output doesn't increase so much. On the other hand, during a period of unemployment, we may get very little adjustment in wages and prices and instead get a big drop in output. This is because of an asymmetry. Wages just go up more easily than they come down because of the bargaining power of workers. And when you see this curve drawn in your textbooks, a short-run aggregate supply curve that has a bend or a kink in it, what it's trying to say is that prices go up more easily than they come down. Now we'll consider what can change equilibrium in the long run. We now have in place all of the pieces of our model of the macroeconomy, and we're ready to put it to work. What we're going to do now is tell some stories about how the economy adjusts in response to some change in the environment. And for every story we tell, there are going to be three parts. First, what happens in the short run? Second, what happens during the adjustment process when prices are changing? And third, where do we wind up in the long run? Now, when you look at this model, you can see that there are only three things that we can shift. We can shift the aggregate demand curve to represent a change in planned spending in the economy. We can shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to represent a change in expectations or a change in long-run aggregate supply. And finally, we can shift the green curve itself. And anytime we shift the green curve to represent a change in the economy's potential output, we have to take the blue curve with it. So let's now do each of those three possible shifts and tell the stories that go along with it. And along the way, we're going to be reviewing everything that we've discussed for the last several discussions. So let's start then with a shift in aggregate demand. A shift in the aggregate demand curve comes about because of a change in the planned spending of consumers, businesses, the government, or perhaps a change in taxes that's going to influence consumer spending. It could also come about because of a change in the spending plans of foreigners and our net exports. And finally, a shift in the money supply on the part of the Fed will influence the interest rates and change planned investment spending. So anytime any of these variables change, they're going to show up as a movement of the red curve. So let's suppose now that there's been an increase in aggregate demand. Consumers want to spend more. Businesses feel confident about the economy and are investing more. The government increases its spending or lowers taxes. Foreigners decide they want to buy more of our products at every price. Or the Fed increases the money supply, reducing the interest rate and stimulating investment spending. This would be shown then as an increase in the aggregate demand curve. So we'll label our original AD0 and our new curve AD1. With this change in aggregate demand now, we're going to get three sets of consequences. The first set of consequences is going to be the short-run consequence. We start with a price level in equilibrium of P0. What happens then when aggregate demand increases is that we have excess aggregate demand. That is, at the original price level, the quantity of goods and services that everyone wants to buy exceeds what businesses are producing. That is the point on the blue supply curve where producers are operating. This leads then to an increase in prices as competition for goods and services bids up prices. As the price level rises, we have a response on both sides of the market. Over here, the rising prices shrinks real wealth, increases the demand for money, pushing up interest rates, and raises the price of our goods relative to foreign goods. All three of these effects reduce the quantity of goods and services that people want to buy as we move along the aggregate demand curve. Businesses respond to the higher price level by sensing profit opportunities and increasing their output. That is, wages are sticky, prices are sticky, and firms are confused. So they make more stuff as prices go up. And that leads us then, in the short run, to a new equilibrium point. And this new equilibrium point we will label P1. So in the short run, what happens is the economy is going faster than its speed limit. That is, Y1 is greater than the full employment level, Y sub F. Now, because Y1 is greater than YF, this short-run position is unsustainable. And what we get then is an upward movement of prices. Because we are exceeding the speed limit, the price level begins to rise. Firms begin to compete aggressively for workers and raw materials, pushing up prices. Now, what happens then in the adjustment process is the rising prices, the increase in wages, and the passage of time cause the blue curve to begin to shift upward. That is, as firms have to pay higher wages to attract workers and the competition pushes the wage level even higher. As firms have to pay higher prices for raw materials. As time passes and labor unions renegotiate their wage contracts. As firms have the opportunity to stamp new prices on their products with the passage of time. And finally, as firms figure out that it's not just their prices that have gone up, but all the prices in the economy, everyone begins to pass these higher prices along. Everyone decides, they form the expectation that inflation has set in, and people begin to raise their prices in anticipation of even more inflation. So the price level goes up with the passage of time, and the fog clears, and everyone realizes that we're in inflation. With inflationary expectations setting in, the short-run aggregate supply curve keeps shifting upwards until we get to the new short-run aggregate supply curve. And I'm going to label this SRAS infinity. because we get to this curve at the end of the adjustment process. There are going to be intermediate steps along the way. The curve will shift up, as I just showed you. That is, we're going to move along the aggregate demand curve as businesses cut back their production and raise their prices. And finally, we wind up at this new long-run macroeconomic equilibrium where the red curve intersects the blue curve, intersects the green curve. So, in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium, firms pass the rising prices on to their customers until aggregate demand is choked back to full employment. Long-run macroeconomic equilibrium occurs where the blue curve and the red curve cross on top of the green curve. That is, we're not in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium until we have returned to full employment and the prices have stopped rising. This is what long-run adjustment looks like. Now, of course, there's the question, how quickly do we get there? And that depends on expectations. If expectations are adaptive, then it may take a long time because people are basing their notion of price changes on what's happened in the previous period. So prices adjust upward gradually. People keep increasing their prices at the same rate that prices increased last year. On the other hand, if expectations are forward-looking and rational, then we move immediately to the new short-run aggregate supply curve because people see that we're past full employment and they raise their prices immediately. They raise their wage demands immediately to get here so that they're not left behind. People anticipate where the economy is going to wind up and they make choices right now that move the economy immediately to that point. One of those choices would be a choice about investment demand. Firms say, well, we are at a point right now where there's a lot of demand in the economy, but we know prices are going to be rising, and when prices rise, people aren't going to buy as much stuff. Plus, interest rates are going to go up. So firms say, whoa, we're not going to invest. We're going to cut back our purchase of plant and equipment and tools so that we don't get stuck with a lot of excess capacity. So anticipating that prices are rising lead businesses to invest less, and that's part of this decrease in aggregate demand. So people are making decisions in a forward-looking fashion that causes the adjustment process to be very quick. On the other hand, when people are making decisions based on what's happened in the past, adaptive expectations, the adjustment process may be slow. Let's consider something else that can happen in the economy. We've shifted the red curve. Now let's do a change that involves the blue curve. This is what's called a supply shock. A supply shock occurs whenever the price of some important input increases dramatically. So suppose we have an increase in the price of raw materials like oil, or an increase in wages due to a sudden surge of strength of labor unions. If that happens, then we show that as an upward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Because of the higher price of inputs, businesses are going to charge customers higher prices for outputs, and as that happens across the economy, we get a new short-run aggregate supply curve representing higher prices. Well, what's going to happen in this economy if we have a supply shock? What's going to be the consequence? Well, let's suppose that we start with a macroeconomic equilibrium in the long run of price of P sub 0, and we're at full employment output. Because if you're not at full employment output, you're not in long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. If we're here to start with, and the supply shock causes businesses to raise their prices and reduce their output, the initial situation is one of excess aggregate demand. People are still buying at the point on the red curve, but businesses want to supply at the point on the blue curve. With this excess aggregate demand, prices are pushed up. And as prices rise, businesses, consumers, and foreigners cut back their demand. Businesses, meanwhile, because of sticky wages, sticky prices, and confusion, increase their output until, in the short run, we find ourselves at this point, P1, an increased price level, and this output level, Y1, which is below full employment. Well, because we're below full employment now, we have downward pressure on prices. Wages and prices tend to fall because of unemployment and slack in the economy. What's going to happen then is that businesses pass these lower costs on in the form of lower prices. Competition leads businesses to lower their prices because wages are falling until we return to the original short-run aggregate supply curve. That is, we're going to be below full employment until the short-run aggregate supply curve moves along the aggregate demand curve, dragging equilibrium back to its original point. So, whenever you have a supply shock, there's going to be a point at which you are below full employment equilibrium in the short run. That is, you're below the long run full employment output. However, because you're in a slack economy, prices are going to fall, and the short run aggregate supply curve moves outward or downward as businesses pass these lower wages and lower costs on to customers in the form of lower goods prices. So because we're on this side of long-run aggregate supply, prices are falling and the blue curve is moving downward back to long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Well, what happens is the price level winds up exactly where it was before. Even though oil may be more expensive, the price of everything else falls until the price level returns to its original level. So a supply shock can give us a temporary period of unemployment and higher prices, but in the long run, everything else adjusts to bring us back exactly where we were to start with. This is the response then of the economy to a supply shock. Once again, the speed of adjustment depends totally on expectations. If people have adaptive expectations, the adjustment period is slow. If they have forward-looking, rational expectations, they immediately see where the economy is going and they make the decisions now that will actually lead to this outcome occurring immediately or very, very quickly. One more possibility to consider. What if the productive capacity of the economy actually changes? What if the green curve shifts? The factors that could lead to a shift in the productive capacity of the economy are, first, an increase in our pool of inputs. What if immigration increases labor, or the accumulation of capital through investment increases our productive capacity? Also, the green curve shifts outwards if there's an improvement in technology, allowing us to make more output with our given inputs. Finally, big changes in the environment could influence our productive capacity. For example, if there's a war that decimates the capital stock or reduces the labor supply, or bad weather that simply allows you to produce less with what you have. Any of these changes are going to shift the green curve by changing the economy's productive capacity, changing the speed limit. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that anytime the green curve shifts, it takes the blue curve with it, because these two curves are stuck together. That is, any change in the economy's productive capacity shows up both in the long run and immediately in the short run. So, for instance, suppose there's an improvement in technology that shifts out what the economy can produce. What you're going to get is the long-run aggregate supply curve shifting out and taking the short-run aggregate supply curve with it. So let's actually now draw those curves and consider what happens first in the short run and then in the long run. So here's the new long-run aggregate supply curve. It's a vertical curve just like its predecessor, and that means our full employment output has moved from YF0 to YF1. With new technology, we can make more with our given inputs. So let me go down here and label this new green curve long-run aggregate supply curve 1. This is its new position. Now the blue curve came right along with it as we saw just a moment ago. So let me draw it in. Here's short-run aggregate supply curve 1. The new curve has shifted outward. That is, with the increase in technology, at any given price level, firms will produce more output than before. Now, what happens to output? Well, first of all, in the short run, we move along the aggregate demand curve to the intersection of the red and blue curves. As you figured out, this is where we always go. We're always going to be where the red curve and the blue curve cross. So originally, we had a price level of P0. After the technological change, we have now excess supply. That is, firms are producing a lot more given their new technology and lower costs, so there's more stuff piling up than people want to buy. This puts downward pressure on prices, leading businesses to cut back their output relative to what they would have produced at the higher price level. And as prices fall, consumers and businesses want to buy more. So the new price level in the short run is going to be where the red and blue curves cross at this point P1. However, relative to the full employment line, we're still below potential. That is, because we are below what the economy could produce with all resources employed, there's going to be downward pressure on prices. Prices are going to tend to fall because we've got unemployment, because we are on the left side of our full employment curve. And as prices fall, we represent that in this picture by a downward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Because there is slack in the labor market and slack in the market for material inputs, the prices of those inputs is going to fall, and firms in competition with one another will pass those lower costs on to their customers in the form of lower prices. Eventually, we get to this point right here, short-run aggregate supply infinity, where the short-run aggregate supply curve winds up when all the price adjustment is done. This is our new long-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Long-run macroeconomic equilibrium occurs at the point where the red and blue curves cross on top of the green curve. We've now got no more price pressure. Look what happened in this case. Prices fell and output increased. Our standard of living unambiguously improved. That's what happens when technology shifts out the green curve. And this is the idea behind supply-side economics, which we'll be discussing later, is that if you change the productive capacity of the economy, you can get lower prices and larger output. Once again, how long does it take us to get from SRAS 0, the original equilibrium, to this new one in infinity? Does it take forever? Well, it might if expectations are adaptive and people keep looking backwards, letting adjustments occur in a slow process. But if there are rational expectations, people see that this is where the economy is going, and competition pushes prices down now, businesses invest more in anticipation of the boom, and people start spending their newfound wealth even before it's completely in the bank. So with rational forward-looking expectations, the adjustment process is very rapid. With backward-looking adaptive expectations, it could take us a long time to get here. You may have seen the national debt clock in Times Square in New York City. Or maybe you've seen one of the debt clocks on the internet warning you about the rate at which the federal government is accumulating debt. Nowadays, the national debt is hot political rhetoric. There are politicians who say that we must pay the debt down now while we can, and that the debt represents some evil. Others saying that it's no cause for concern. Should you be worried? How does an economist think about the national debt? Let's start with the question of what it is. The national debt is the money that the government has borrowed over time to pay for government spending in excess of taxes. In any given year, if the government spends more than it takes in tax revenue, this is called deficit spending, and these budget deficits add up to form the national debt. The government finances deficit spending by issuing IOUs, treasury bills, bonds, and notes, and other government bonds. If you take the total quantity, the total value, the total amount of outstanding bonds, you've got the national debt. Right now, the national debt in the United States is equal to about $5.7 trillion. Is that a lot? Well, it depends on who you ask. The United States has the largest government debt of any country in the world. And yet, if you compare our national debt with our gross domestic product, the United States isn't doing so bad. National debt in the United States is only about 60% of gross domestic product, compared with 130% for Belgium and 90% for Canada. Lots of countries have much higher ratios of debt to gross domestic product than the United States. But just because we're not doing as badly as some other country, should we still relax? Is the national debt a problem? What is the concern? Well, usually people think that debt is a bad thing because it means that in the future you're going to have to cut back your spending in order to pay back what you've borrowed. Is this the case with the national debt? Who have we borrowed it from? Don't confuse the national debt with the United States foreign debt. Foreign debt is the net amount of money that the government and private borrowers have borrowed from people overseas. In time, that money will have to be paid back, and that means a real transfer of resources from the United States to foreign countries in order to settle that debt. So the foreign debt may be a cause for concern, but even that we're going to reconsider in a moment. What about the national debt? The national debt is money that the government has borrowed in the United States from its own citizens. As a lender to the government, I am paying money to buy a government bond. I've lent my money, and therefore in the future the government is going to pay this money back to me with interest. And interest is the key idea here, because the government will pay off its bonds by raising taxes in the future, which means that those of us, those U.S. citizens and other nationals here in this country who hold these bonds, are due money from the government. That is, I'm going to collect money from you when you pay your taxes that enable the government to settle the debt in the future. So the national debt is not really money that the United States owes to anyone. It's money that is going to be transferred between taxpayers and those who have bought government securities in order to finance the debt. In the meantime, those of you who don't hold bonds are on net paying taxes that cover the interest for those of us who do hold bonds. So as a bondholder, I'm collecting interest from my fellow American citizens and other people in the U.S. who pay taxes that goes to cover the interest stream that I get as a bondholder. It's a redistribution of money within our economy. It's not like money that we owe to someone outside. If we defaulted, if the U.S. government defaulted on the national debt tomorrow, there would be no net destruction of anything of value. Just those of us who hold bonds would suddenly find them worthless. It would be as if the government in one fell swoop redistributed money from bondholders to everyone else. So the national debt is not as much of a problem as perhaps your credit card debt or even your student loan is, because these are amounts of money that you owe to someone in the future, and you're going to have to reduce your consumption, perhaps your standard of living, in order to settle the debt. For the U.S. as a whole, however, the national debt is money that we owe to each other. So does this mean that the national debt is nothing to be worried about? No, absolutely not. There are three concerns that are associated with the national debt that can cause problems for an economy. The first is inflation. If the government is tempted to print money to redeem its bonds and pay off its debts, then this increase in the money supply could spark inflation in the future. When the national debt gets bigger and bigger and there's concern that the government may print money to pay it off, then people get nervous that inflation is a real prospect. Another concern is higher taxation. The more outstanding debt there is, the more the government will have to raise taxes in the future to pay off the debt. And these higher taxes have distortionary consequences in the economy. They can slow down the economy by making people unwilling to work and save because their returns are not so big because they have to pay higher tax rates to service the debt. The third concern about the national debt is that government borrowing crowds out private investment. As the government borrows more and more money, it pushes up interest rates and competition for funds. That means private investors and households borrow less because of the higher interest rates. And every business that doesn't get built because the government is borrowing money, every kid who doesn't go to college, that's a lost investment opportunity that could increase the standard of living in our economy in the long run. In that sense, the debt is in some way borrowing from future generations, because we're reducing productive capacity when the government borrows money now and takes it away from others who might want to borrow it to do business investments and investments in human capital. However, if the government is borrowing money in order to build roads and bridges and other capital projects that increase the value of opportunities in the economy, that increase opportunities and make business easier to do. If the government is using borrowed money to invest in public goods, then the government is creating opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist. The government could be investing in defense, it could be investing in streetlights, it could be investing in the internet. All of these things create business opportunities rather than reduce them. Which brings us to kind of the final word on debt. It all depends on what you're doing with the money. Are you investing in something that's creating an asset that's going to yield value in the future that enables you to pay off the debt with profits to spare? Or are you investing the money in a good time right now that is borrowing money for consumer goods, meaning that in the future you'll have to pay it off in terms of the lost opportunities? That is, everything we spend on consumption goods now is money and resources that aren't being invested in things that can create a higher standard of living down the road. What about the surplus? There's a lot of talk nowadays about how the United States budget has moved into surplus. Well, this surplus is an opportunity to pay down the debt. Does that mean that we should? Not necessarily. Every time we use the surplus to redeem outstanding bonds, we're taking bonds out of circulation, and these bonds are an important component of capital markets. What's the market going to do when all of the 30-year Treasury bills and bonds have been retired? What's the market going to do? When the 30-year Treasury bond is gone, then long-term securities are not so easily accessible to people who want long-term safe investments, and that's going to create some disruptions in the financial markets, as we've seen in the early months of 2000. But the surplus itself is an opportunity to pay down the national debt, just as the deficit was the opportunity to accumulate it. You needn't think of the U.S. national debt in the same way that you think about your own credit card debts, because it's not money that's owed to someone outside. On the other hand, there is a cost, because when the government borrows money, it directs resources away from other people who might use this money to build factories and create opportunities for increases in value in the economy. Can the government use this money and invest in capital as effectively as business and other people in the private sector? That's the question. If the government has opportunities, then its debt is a good thing. It's borrowing to increase our standard of living in the long run. On the other hand, if the government is borrowing to invest in unproductive products and projects, then the government is imposing a cost on us. But it's odd the way debt works, because it's really you and I who owe the money to each other, even though the government is doing the transaction. A British economist, A.W. Phillips, observed an interesting relationship between inflation and unemployment. Looking at data from Britain over a very long period of time, he saw that there was an inverse relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. That is, when the unemployment rate was low, the rate of inflation tended to be high, and vice versa. In this discussion, we're going to try to account for Phillips' observation as we develop a tool that represents his conclusion, called the Phillips Curve. We want to start with the question, what causes inflation? And there really are two components to the answer. First of all, rising prices, or inflation, are associated with competition for scarce resources. When the economy is being driven very, very hard and more jobs are being created and factories are trying to buy raw materials to expand their output, when the economy is growing rapidly, that tends to create inflation as businesses compete for scarce resources like labor and raw materials. So that's one thing. The inflation rate is going to represent scarcity that occurs when the economy is growing faster. When the economy is growing slower, then there's going to be less price pressure, and the inflation rate will tend to be lower. The second thing that can cause inflation is simply people's expectations. When people believe that they are in a period of inflation, they're going to include a demand for higher wages in any contracts they negotiate. After all, if the inflation rate is 5%, then I believe the cost of living will rise 5% this year. I'm going to ask my boss to include a cost of living adjustment in my wage contract so that my wages rise along with the prices of goods and services, and my standard of living doesn't get shrunken by inflation. Now, what happens, of course, is if wages are rising by 5%, my employer has to pass those costs on to customers by increasing his or her prices by 5%. So wages rising causes prices to rise, which causes wages to rise and prices to rise again, so that the expectation of inflation gets embedded in the economy and it becomes kind of self-perpetuating. So, two things that cause inflation. Demand for raw materials pushes up costs and causes businesses to increase prices. That's the relationship between the growth of the economy and rising prices. The second thing is expectations. Once the economy gets used to inflation, inflation just perpetuates itself. Now, with this in mind, we can draw a relationship between the inflation rate in the economy and the unemployment rate. This relationship is called the Phillips Curve. To set up our Phillips Curve, let me offer a couple of definitions. The first definition we're going to call the natural rate of unemployment, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. This is the rate of unemployment that is associated with a stable rate of inflation. The natural rate of unemployment is associated with the level of output that does not cause prices to increase at an increasing rate. Suppose the economy is at this natural rate of unemployment. If it's there, then any attempt to increase output in the economy faster is going to start to drive up prices at an accelerating rate as there's intense competition for labor and other raw materials. On the other hand, if the economy grows more slowly than the speed limit, there's going to be slack. There's going to be extra unemployment and unused raw materials, which will put downward pressure on their prices, lowering costs and causing inflation to occur at a slower rate. So here's the break point in the economy, the natural rate or non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. It's the speed limit of the economy. Try to drive the economy faster and inflation accelerates. Drive the economy slower and you get a lower rate of inflation. The next thing I want to define is the underlying rate of inflation in the economy. And this underlying rate of inflation in the economy is driven probably by the growth rate of the money supply. The faster the money supply grows, the faster prices tend to rise. But it's also heavily influenced, by people's expectations. If people expect or get used to a higher rate of inflation, that higher rate of inflation gets built into wage contracts and so forth, becoming the underlying rate of inflation for the economy. Now, this underlying rate will adjust over time, either as the growth rate of the money supply changes or as people's expectations change. If people expect a lower rate of inflation, they start requesting smaller wage increases from year to year, and the rate of increase in prices slows down. All right, so we've defined two things. We've defined the natural rate of unemployment, which for the sake of our example, we're going to assume is 5%. And we've defined an underlying rate of inflation. That's the rate of inflation that you would get if the economy is right at the speed limit, right at the break point before inflation will be pressed to accelerate by driving the economy faster. So let's put a point here. Suppose the underlying inflation rate for the economy is 5%. So if we put a 5% inflation rate here on this axis, then we start with this point right here. If we are at our speed limit, we have 5% inflation. Now, what's going to happen if we decide we want to drive the economy faster? If we drive the economy faster, we're going to get a lower unemployment rate. That is, we're going to be pulling people into jobs that are presently not finding them. So if you drive the economy faster, you get something that's good. You get more output and you get less unemployment. So here's what we get. However, driving the economy faster means that you are pushing the labor market into shortage. You're creating a tighter labor market. It's harder to hire people now, and wages begin to rise. And with those rising wages from competition for labor, you get rising prices, which is a bad thing. So to countervail or to balance the good thing, we get a little bit of bad too. So what we get is another point here with less unemployment. Maybe the unemployment rate is pushed down to 4%. However, the cost of that reduction in unemployment is a higher inflation rate. Maybe it goes up to 7%. So here's another point that's possible for the economy. And we can keep having trade-offs here. We can increase output more, reducing unemployment further, but at the cost of a more rapid increase in prices. And if you want to push it even further, you can have even more inflation. The more we reduce unemployment in this story, the faster you're going to push prices upward as the labor market gets tighter and tighter and tighter, and wages start rising more and more rapidly. So what you get then here is an inverse relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. The harder you drive the economy, the lower the unemployment rate goes. However, this intense competition for labor begins to push up wages and prices faster. It's like a trade-off. And the same thing would be true if we went the other way. If we wanted to reduce inflation in our economy, we could do it. We could get rid of some of this increase in prices, but the cost would be we would push some workers out of a job. And we can keep making this trade-off, less inflation, but if we have less inflation, we're going to be producing less output, which means more unemployment. So the curve goes the other direction. That is, you can get lower inflation rates, but only if you're willing to accept a higher unemployment rate. That's the way the trade-off works. This inverse relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, this menu of possibilities is called the Phillips Curve, after A.W. Phillips, who looked at the wage data from Britain. Now, suppose that we try to drive the economy faster than its speed limit in the long run. Suppose we try to violate the speed limit and we're back here at 4% unemployment, which is an unemployment rate that is below the natural rate. We're trying to produce too much. We're trying to pull too much labor into the market. What's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is people are going to get tired of working overtime. They're going to start asking for higher wages. And eventually what happens is the economy starts to adjust. And as prices rise in the economy, then people are going to say to themselves, it's really not worth it to work these extra hours. And people are going to go back to their old habits of labor and leisure. And the economy is going to find itself back, as we'll see in our next discussion, it's going to find itself back at the natural rate of unemployment in the long run. However, because we've been driving the economy harder, people are now used to 7% inflation. And because they're used to 7% inflation, they are including that expectation in their demands for higher wages every year. So 7% becomes the underlying rate of inflation for the economy because people have come to expect it. That means when the economy adjusts back to full employment, as it, in its natural course of things, returns to full employment, now it's going to return to full employment with a higher rate of inflation than before because people's expectations have changed. So I can draw a new Phillips curve now. The range of possible trade-off has been changed. We now, if we're at full employment, are going to have the new underlying rate of 7% as our inflation rate, and now we can choose trade-offs along this dotted Phillips curve. The Phillips curve shifts upwards when people get used to a higher rate of inflation. When the underlying or expected rate of inflation moves up, usually because we've spent some time over here in an overheated economy, then the whole Phillips curve shifts up because now you've got to coax people harder if you want to get them to work faster than the speed limit. You've got to give them even more wage increases. So trying to keep the economy over here running faster than the speed limit winds up shifting the Phillips curve upwards as the underlying rate of inflation, the expected rate of inflation, gets pushed up. Now in the long run, you're always going to wind up on the speed limit. That is, in the long run, we can't hold the economy faster than the speed limit. Prices are going to start to rise so rapidly that eventually we just find ourselves back on this curve. Again, we'll see how that works in the next discussion when we look at the aggregate demand and aggregate supply representation of Phillips' idea. But let me say right now, the Phillips curve in the long run is vertical. It's vertical because in the long run, you've got to be at the full employment level of unemployment. In the long run, you've got to be at the natural rate because otherwise you're going to be in a situation of instability. As long as you're over here, running the economy faster than the speed limit, the Phillips curve tends to shift upwards. As long as you're over here with a higher unemployment rate, there's going to be downward pressure on the inflation rate, and the Phillips curve is going to tend to shift downward. The only stable Phillips curve occurs whenever you are on the natural rate of unemployment. It's only when you're on the green line that the Phillips curve doesn't tend to shift up or downward over time. So let's look at how our theory jives with some actual data for the United States. If we look at the data from the 1960s, we see a very smooth downward sloping trade-off between the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis and the inflation rate on the vertical axis. As the economy built up to the Vietnam War, the rate of inflation was pushed up as government spending and a defense buildup drove the economy very, very hard. That is, we pushed ourselves faster than the speed limit, the unemployment rate fell below the natural rate, and the rate of price increase began to rise. So what we get in the 1960s appears to be the Phillips curve of our theory. However, what happened in the 1970s made a mockery of that Phillips curve. Here we had our Phillips curve, but then in the 1970s, we wind up with all these data points that involve more inflation and more unemployment than the points on this curve. That is, it appears that the whole Phillips curve has shifted upwards. This is called stagflation, when the inflation rate increases at the same time that the unemployment rate increases. Now, what would cause the Phillips curve to shift outward? Here in 1970, 72, and 73, we've got a trade-off at a higher level, that is, more inflation for any given amount of unemployment. Probably because, as inflation began to pick up in the late 1960s, people in the economy digested this and it became part of their expectations. That is, as people got used to an inflation rate above 4%, they factored that into their demands for wages, and businesses got used to increasing their prices at a faster rate than before. So the data from the 1960s taken with the data from the 1970s matches pretty well the picture we drew a minute ago, which is as long as inflation expectations remain constant, you get a smooth downward sloping trade-off. However, when inflation expectations increase, then you get a new curve that's further out. Now, this suggests that it may be possible in the short run to make a choice between inflation and unemployment. However, in the long run, that's not going to be possible, because in the long run, people will get used to a higher rate of inflation, they build that into their expectations, and they become unwilling to work unless wages begin to increase at an even more rapid rate. So in the long run, the Phillips curve is going to be vertical. In the short run, however, there's a possibility of a trade-off between inflation and unemployment.